Major breaking news, a huge win for President Donald J. Trump and the Republican Party as they work hard to keep control of the House of Representatives after the 2026 midterms. The United States Supreme Court has just stepped in and slapped down a decision by a 3-judge panel that had found that Texas's attempts to redraw congressional lines to add 5 Republican seats effectively. The lower court had said this was illegal. The Supreme Court said no can do. The lower court messed this up, and that will not stand. Big win for Trump, and as predicted on this channel, the dissent by Judge Jerry Smith in this case has been vindicated by none other than the United States Supreme Court. We're going to break it down when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney. Remember the United States Supreme Court bar and proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. And while we're on the topic, as you know, I've been nominated again, this time for the 2026 Gundy Awards for top voice of the Second Amendment yet again. So if you're so willing to go to thegundys.com and vote in the category of top voice of the 2A, I ask you to vote for 4 Boxes Diner and Mark Smith. See if we can repeat our victory from 2025 and 2026. It's tough, but we got fingers crossed and candles lit. I thank you for your support. It is a great honor just to be nominated. All right, folks, another big win for President Donald J. Trump. In this case, involving an attempt to thwart the state of Texas that had redrawn congressional lines in an attempt to add 5 additional Republican House seats after the 2026 midterms. As you may recall, there's been games played for many years by blue state jurisdictions to gerrymander situations where even though you have maybe even close to a 50-50 split between Democratic voters and Republican voters, the legislatures of the blue states have drawn maps such that, for example, in the entire Northeast, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island have that would be 0, that would be nada, Republican House members in the U.S. Representatives, despite about 40-some-odd% of the voters voting for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. To offset this game that's been played by the Democrats for many decades, Donald Trump urged states like Texas to redraw their congressional lines right here and right now, which is what Texas did, redrawing their congressional lines, which, based on the math, should give rise to an additional 5 Republican House members after the 2026 elections to be able to sit in Washington, D.C. as part of the House of Representatives. This is what the Texas state legislature did at the urging of Governor Greg Abbott. A lawsuit was filed by the League of United Latin American Citizens against Greg Abbott in the state of Texas, arguing that this new gerrymander, this new line drawing situation in Texas was motivated by unlawful, illegal race discrimination. That the reason why Texas redrew these lines was not because of pure partisan politics that says we want to throw the Democrats under the bus and help the Republicans win in the Washington, D.C. to save America from the communist movement. No, this lawsuit argued that the real reason, or a main reason, why Texas decided in the middle of this sort of decade to redraw these lines was because of race discrimination. They wanted to discriminate on the basis of race, and not because they wanted to advance pure partisan politics in favor of the Republicans at the expense of the Democrats. As you know, under, for example, the Voting Rights Act, and under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and the 15th Amendment, you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of someone's race, the immutable characteristic of someone's race. You cannot discriminate on that basis. It is illegal under the Constitution and federal law. In contrast, there is nothing in the Constitution, and there's nothing in federal statutory law that says that Democrats cannot prefer Democrats over Republicans and Republicans cannot prefer Republicans over Democrats. In other words, if you want to discriminate on the basis of who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, who's a conservative, who's a progressive, that's perfectly okie dokie. That's called pure partisan politics. Nothing wrong with that. That's just the way the system works. And yet, what happened in this lawsuit was that a 3-judge panel in a 2-1 decision ruled that they believed that the state of Texas was not motivated by pure partisan politics in favor of the Republican Party, but was instead motivated by race. And therefore, the 3-judge panel in a 2-1 decision said that the prior existing maps of the House drawn lines in the state of Texas had to revert back to where they were prior to the summer of 2025, which essentially would have the effect of preserving 5 Democrats in the House of Representatives from Texas that would otherwise likely be redrawn out of existence and out of power in Washington, D.C. So this 2-1 decision by this 3-judge panel ruled in favor of the plaintiffs against Greg Abbott and against the Republican Party and against the state of Texas. You may recall we covered this extensively. There was a very powerful dissent by United States Federal Court of Appeals Judge Jerry Smith. Judge Jerry Smith attacked the 2-judge majority in great detail, pointing out not only the errors of their ways legally, but the errors of their ways factually, and the games that had been played by releasing the majority opinion before Judge Jerry Smith had a chance to release simultaneously his dissent. Judge Jerry Smith went into great detail why all this was wrong. I covered on this channel, and then I pointed out to you that Judge Jerry Smith was a respected judge in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that I suspected the U.S. Supreme Court was going to take a look at that dissent by Judge Smith and likely rule in favor of Judge Smith, i.e., concluding that the decision-making of the 2 judges in the majority was a no-go zone, was not according to Hoyle, and would be reversed. And that is exactly what has just occurred. The United States Supreme Court has just entered a stay or a pause of that 2-1 anti-Texas, anti-Trump decision, which means as a consequence, the Supreme Court has just signed off on the state of Texas and their lawmakers using the newly redrawn congressional maps that favor Republicans in the 2026 midterm elections. This is a huge win, folks, for the Republican Party, for the state of Texas, and for President Donald Trump, who is trying to prevent the Democrats from taking over the House of Representatives after the 2026 midterms, which will give rise to countless investigations, the cutting of funding for ICE, and all sorts of other nonsense. As you well know what the Democrats will do if they get back into power in any respect. Now, the basis of this decision, we don't know exactly the breakdown, but what we do know is that the 3 usual suspect lefties, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Brown Jackson, they dissented from this, so we know that at least 3 of the justices disagreed with this decision to stand up for the rule of law and President Trump in the Texas attempt to do gerrymandering on partisan grounds. We do know that. So here's what the U.S. Supreme Court had to say in the majority, and this is an unsigned opinion, so we don't know exactly who wrote it. We'll get to the concurrence in a moment by Justice Alito, but here's what the Supreme Court had to say in describing the issue when they issued this order in favor of Texas and against the progressives. With an eye on the upcoming 2026 midterm elections, several states have in recent months redrawn their congressional districts in ways that are predicted to favor the state's dominant political party. Texas adopted the first new map, then California responded with its own map for the stated purpose of counteracting what Texas had done. North Carolina followed suit, and other states are also considering new maps. The respondents in this case, that would be the plaintiffs down below, challenged the new Texas map, contending that the legislature's motive was predominantly racial. A divided 3-judge district court agreed and enjoined the use of the new map in the 2026 elections. With the 2026 campaign already underway, the state of Texas and several of its officials applied to the Supreme Court for a stay of the lower court order. That's right. And what did the Supreme Court do? We know what the majority did. They agreed with President Trump and the Republican Party and the state of Texas and said that the lower court screwed this up. Here's what they had to say in ruling that a stay of the lower court decision that, had it not been stayed, would basically allow the Californians to basically redraw their map in favor of the Democrats, but would stop the Texans from being able to redraw their map in favor of the Republicans. Here's what the Supreme Court had to say in telling the plaintiffs and the 3-judge panel that they are not going to get what they want. Here's what the court had to say. Based on our preliminary evaluation of this case, Texas satisfies the traditional criteria for interim relief. Texas is likely to succeed on the merits of its claim that the district court committed at least two serious errors. First, the district court failed to honor the presumption of legislative good faith by construing ambiguous, direct, and circumstantial evidence against the legislature. Second, the district court panel failed to draw a dispositive or near dispositive adverse inference against respondents, that's the plaintiffs, even though they did not produce a viable alternative map that met the state's avowedly partisan goals. That's right. Because remember, if there's any doubt, really any doubt about whether or not the legislature of Texas or any legislature was engaged in pure partisan politics, meaning I want Republicans to win or I want the Democrats to win, as opposed to race discrimination, under Supreme Court precedent, the presumption is that it's partisan politics because, well, that's what legislatures do, right? They're partisans. They're Democrats. They're Republicans. They do what's best for them politically, which is perfectly legal. Nothing wrong with that, as long as, of course, they don't violate the Constitution. Race discrimination is not allowed, but partisan politics in favor of one political party over another is perfectly fine. And here, it's pretty clear, at least according to the Supreme Court, that the plaintiffs that were trying to stop or enjoin the newly redrawn map in favor of the Republicans, they were not able to establish, according to the Supreme Court, by a large percentage, of whatever you want to call it, that race was the motivating factor here, and they lay out a series of reasons for that. And what's quite interesting, though, is there's the dissent, which in some ways actually corroborates the majority decision here by the Supreme Court. The dissent here, written by the former Dean of the Harvard Law School, Justice Elena Kagan. Justice Kagan wrote the dissent with the support of Justice Sotomayor and Justice Brown Jackson. And Justice Kagan basically admits in her dissent, saying that, she obviously thinks the Democrats should win this case, but she basically admits that, the evidence is it's pure partisan politics. There's a lot of evidence here. Here's what the dissent has to say, which, as I read it, actually favors the Supreme Court's ruling here and Judge Jerry Smith's dissent in the lower court by finding essentially, this is about pure partisan politics. This is not about race discrimination. Let me know what you think. Here's what Justice Kagan had to say in dissenting from the Supreme Court's decision to stay that lower court decision. True, the ultimate goal of Texas's redistricting was to pick up Republican seats, but substantial evidence revealed that race predominated in the actual drawing of district lines. So the district court concluded, in acting to advance partisan interests, Texas racially gerrymandered the 2025 map. There you go. Basically, even the dissent is acknowledging that the motive behind these redrawing of the lines of where congressional seats are in Texas was motivated by helping Republicans. Now, here's sort of the way the game gets played by the Democrats. It has been for many decades, and I think it's getting fixed now by the Supreme Court and, frankly, by this Department of Justice and the Solicitor General John Sauer working under the Attorney General Pam Bondi, trying to fix up some of these electoral games that the Democrats have been playing all across this country. And that is, of course, that these maps are drawn to ensure in many aspects that you have African-American representation, that you almost ensure that you have an African-American and or Hispanic congressperson sent to Washington, D.C., and these maps are drawn in such a way to ensure that you basically have certain districts that are Hispanic, represented by a Hispanic person, certain districts that are represented by an African-American person in Congress. The problem there, of course, is that overwhelmingly the Hispanics and the blacks in these areas are Democrats. So what you've essentially done is you've created safe seats for Democrats in the name of sort of racial diversity. And the Supreme Court is starting to fix this by saying you can't consider race in that way, because whether you discriminate against whites, discriminate against blacks, discriminate against Hispanics, none of this is allowed under the law. And that's kind of what's been going on. That is the subject, of course, of the Louisiana versus Calais case, which will be resolved later this year. We don't need to belabor the point here, but that all is coming together as one big gestalt to fix a lot of this over the next several months. So another huge win for President Trump. I just want to make two kind of general points here. Again, the Attorney General Pam Bondi and her Solicitor General John Sauer continues to bat almost close to 100% at the U.S. Supreme Court on these emergency applications. I think the big thing is not so much that the Supreme Court is pro-Republican or pro-Trump. I think the reality is that these lower court judges, in many instances, are engaged in such rogue lawfare against the Trump administration that the Supreme Court has no choice but to spank them and to fix this. And that's what keeps happening, because this is simply an absurd ruling to think that Texas engaged in a mid-decade drawing of the lines for any other purpose than to advance political partisan interest, right? And somehow they still had to get involved in this, massive multi-month litigation. And remind you one thing. I want to remind you of one thing. One of the arguments here is that there was this delay in all these lawsuits. But the reason, of course, why there was a delay in all these lawsuits, you may remember, is that when Texas was trying to redraw the lines through the legislature, the Democrats in the Texas legislature ran away bravely, right? They bravely ran away to the state of Illinois to avoid quorum from being established in the state house, and that delayed the voting of the new maps, which delayed the lawsuit, which now pushed this lawsuit up against these hard deadlines, like the December 8th, 2025 deadline, whereby people have to identify the congressional district they want to run in and declare and start their campaign. And that, I'm sure, is one of the factors here that the Supreme Court looked at this and said, look, it's just too late in the day to try to change all this stuff up. We're right on the eve of an election under a Supreme Court case called Purcell. You're not supposed to be changing election rules on the eve of an election, because it messes up the voters and the whole state in terms of effectuating and administering the election. And I think that definitely played a role here, although the Purcell case was not directly mentioned by the Supreme Court majority. But the bottom line is this: a big win for Donald Trump, a big win for the Republicans, big win for Greg Abbott, a big win for the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton down there, who's in a Senate race against John Cornyn. So with all that said, great news here on Friday morning, and I appreciate you tuning into the Four Boxes Diner. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so both on Rumble and on YouTube. Don't forget to follow me over there on X at Four Boxes Diner, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.